my comments will be maybe context setting more than a direct exploration of this theme of disagreement without demonization, though I think it touches on it in its own way. You might say it gets at a context in which even the appeal to civility, which has often been made, particularly on the part of Christians and conservative Christians, is itself beginning to erode. And so what I'd like to do here is to lead off with a quotation from a very controversial essay that's been published in recent months by the Iranian-American journalist Sohrab Ahmari. This was written in First Things, and it has its own context, and I want to make very clear that I'm not going to try to interpret him for himself. There's been a huge explosion of essays around this and lots of responses, but nevertheless, it speaks to this kind of questioning of whether we should be civil at all. And certainly I will say that among my friends, many of my friends who have leading roles in institutions and in foundations, who are really at the centers of you might say, power in a worldly sense, are very attracted to this. This represents a kind of, what? Someone is finally telling us we could actually get away with using the tactics of our opponents. We can play without any rules. That's very attractive to many people in ways that I have to say I've found somewhat shocking. So let me begin with this, and then we'll look at a kind of John Paul II and Hildebrandian response to this new tendency. So Ahmari writes at the end of this essay, but conservative Christians can't afford these luxuries. So broadly, civil participation in public life. Progressives understand that the culture war means discrediting their opponents and weakening or destroying their institutions. Conservatives should approach the culture war with a similar realism. Civility and decency are secondary values. They regulate compliance with an established order and orthodoxy. We should seek to use these values to enforce our order and our orthodoxy, not pretend that they can ever be neutral. To recognize that enmity is real. To recognize that enmity is real is its own kind of moral duty. So again, let's not try to interpret too much everything he's saying. There are aspects of what's said that we might agree with, but nevertheless, there's a sentiment here, and the way it's being embraced by many, many people I find to be very troubling, including people very much broadly speaking, within our orbit. Perhaps the one thing that could be said right at the outset is that there's a straw man problem here, which is that the kind of civility that is being attacked here is arguably itself a kind of social remnant of a time in which other values were at stake. It seems to me often it doubles as a kind of synonym for niceness, getting along. You get these kind of almost pastoral images of families and neighborhoods living together, and everyone's, all of us with our differences are at the barbecue and we're getting along, and there's this sort of this image that I think probably doesn't really express what civility would be like in any circumstance of deep disagreement. But we can perhaps put that aside because that, again, is not maybe what I want to sort of chase here in terms of my theme. So I'd like to look at the selection in the Reader, which is from Centesimus Annus, the great encyclical of John Paul II. And I selected it because it gives expression, as I see it, to a completely different personalistic vision of what it means to live under the truth in a way that accepts its demands of us, but at the same time in a way that involves living in accordance with truth when that truth is denied in fundamental ways, when one has not just a culture that is hostile, but an entire regime that seeks to oppress. And let me read just a few lines here this is on page 233. I want to make clear here that what I'm trying to do in some ways is evoke a kind of personalism. I don't want to invoke the personalism of great personalists, not necessarily to sort of look into all of the ways in which they would ground it in their philosophy. And I think it's important to do both, but also to look at these concrete examples because they are such rich sources of reflection and prompt our own better philosophizing. So he says here at the bottom of page 233, Also worthy of emphasis is the fact that this kind of bloc or empire was accomplished, that the fall of this kind of bloc or empire was accomplished almost everywhere by means of peaceful protest, using only the weapons of truth and justice, while Marxism held that only by exacerbating social conflicts was it possible to resolve them through violent confrontation. The protests which led to the collapse of Marxism tenaciously insisted on trying every avenue of negotiation, dialogue, and witness to the truth, appealing to the conscience of the adversary and seeking to reawaken in him a sense of shared human dignity. And just one more line here. He says, it seemed that the European order resulting from the Second World War and sanctioned by the Yalta Agreements could only be overturned by another war. Instead, it has been overcome by the nonviolent commitment of people who, while always refusing to yield to the force of power, succeeded time after time in finding effective ways of bearing witness to the truth. Now, I've shared this passage with friends of mine of late who in fact are very sympathetic to this, and I get a kind of Amarian response, which is that, well, that project failed. The project of John Paul II failed. The hope of a democratic capitalism that would bring together the three spheres that Elizabeth spoke of yesterday, it's not working. We're in an ideological age. Christians are going to be oppressed, and so on and so forth. Therefore, this is a kind of it's a kind of dream to appeal to this. Now, I think that without trying to speak for John Paul in a way that I can't, I think we have to resist one temptation here, which is to have, and perhaps it was tempting to read this when he first wrote, with the idea that the main point he's making here is that witness to truth, nonviolent witness to truth, should be pursued because it's effective. It's more effective than violence, and it works. You know, a kind of utilitarian defense of this. And of course, I think we can imagine that John Paul, had he had to write an encyclical to the suffering Polish church under a continuing communist regime, would have appealed to all the same values. I don't think he would have encouraged violence. In fact, we all know the great stories told by Rocco Buttiglione of how John Paul was actually instrumental in talking the frustrated solidarity movement out of finally giving in to the temptation to violence. So I think that this same idea that we play not just on the stage of the world and in the kind of culture that we want to live in, but that we play also on a more fundamental moral and religious stage, the moral stage in which we determine ourselves morally as persons, the religious stage, which is one in which we ultimately act only before God. And to sort of develop that and to conclude my remarks, I want to turn to von Hildebrand and his witness against Nazism. Of course, many of you know here, so I won't tell the fascinating story, but he felt as a Catholic philosopher called to bear witness. He felt it was a kind of scandal if, as a Catholic and a philosopher, he would not openly speak against the Nazi regime. And but he didn't do this in the mode of an academic. He didn't ask for a course load on the study of totalitarian regimes. Though he continued to teach during this time, he identified where he thought he could be most effective. He said to the Austrian chancellor who ultimately sponsored a journal that von Hildebrand founded, "I want to be an intellectual officer in the battle against National Socialism and against Bolshevism." And he was very keen on trying to make a difference with this journal. He wanted to encourage Germans back home not to lose their moral resolve. He wanted to prop up the Austrian regime so that it wouldn't give in to the temptation to somehow enter into dealings with the Nazi regime. He wanted to ensure that they would stand their ground. And there were many other things that he was trying to do that were practical, concrete, that you could say were the sort of things that reflected a desire not just to sort of fight evil with goodness and error with truthfulness, but to actually realize these in a meaningful way. But in von Hildebrand's case, unlike in the circumstance that John Paul describes, the situation was bad from the beginning, and it only got worse. Perhaps a more calculating person would have said, I'm not achieving my ends here, I'm going to go somewhere else, or I'll just go somewhere safer. But for von Hildebrand, again, there were these two stages of life. There was the stage of the world and our actions on that stage, and there was the stage the moral stage, the religious stage on which one stands before one's conscience, so to speak, the call of conscience and the call of God. And so as things got progressively worse, he never abandoned his post, and he saw himself as he thought that until the bitter end he could at least bear witness to the truth about Nazism. Just as a kind of a subpoint, I would say that this was not just a warring against a kind of philosophical sort of assault on National Socialism, which it was, but to the point that we've talked about before, which is being able to hear one's opponent. He didn't try to see the good in Nazism ever, or in communism, but he did try to understand why people were attracted to it. And so devoted many of his articles in his journal to trying to explain to people what attracted them in National Socialism, and then showing them how this was a fraud, that this wasn't a response to what they really wanted. So if they were drawn by the kind of populism and sense of national identity, he pointed out to them that this was in fact a yearning for true community, for example. And he wrote beautifully on community in that respect. So let me just end on a Hildebrandian sort of note here by quoting him. This is actually in the, it's one of the quotations that I selected to go at the beginning of the book, because I think it expresses so much the essential Hildebrandian spirit. He says, there was a moment where there was a famous German priest who was sort of scandalized by von Hildebrand because he thought, this is such muddy logic, but he thought, look, National Socialism is inevitable. Why can't you shouldn't stand against this historical inevitability. You need to sort of line yourself up to participate in this and give it a Catholic focus. And von Hildebrand wrote back, this is part of his letter to this priest. He says, God calls us to fight the Antichrist in Nazism, not in the people, but in the ideology. God calls us to fight the Antichrist regardless of whether we triumph, which is ultimately up to God. If God permits evils such as Bolshevism and National Socialism, then of course, as St. Paul says, it is to test us. It is precisely our struggle against evil that God wills, even when we suffer external defeat. Thank you.
Thank you, John Henry. And now for Patrick.
Yes, thank you, John Henry. I also want to take a moment to thank the panelists and respondents from this morning. It was one of the richest conversations I've been able to witness in a panel structure, and it was remarkable. It was a real gift to, certainly I felt it was a real gift to me intellectually. This afternoon's topic is of particular interest to the Elm Institute, which I direct, and I am deeply indebted to my colleague Peter Wicks for the formation of some of my own thoughts on the matter. I think it's really important that when we take up topics like this, that we acknowledge the intellectual friendships that shape us, right? In professional life, we refer to mentors and folks who shape our careers in this way, and I think it's very, very important that we sort of give not just intellectual genealogies of ourselves, but sort of living genealogies of the flow of intellectual life back and forth in that sort of swirl among us. A great deal of my time is spent listening to folks on the political left and right lament the polarization, groupthink, tribalism, and identity politics in our universities and our larger society. I, in turn, spend a great deal of my time trying to convince these folks that we are largely speaking of symptoms that point to deeper, more fundamental failings in these institutions and the broader culture. There are two general observations I would like to offer on the topic of disagreement and demonization. The first regards our moral vocabulary, and the second, the current moral and social landscape of disagreement and demonization. I think these reflections may provide us with reasons to think that things are a lot worse than they seem, and that everything is not nearly as bad as it is made out to be. And I'm not sure what to do with that. You may recall a passage in Joseph Pieper's rich essay on the cardinal virtue of justice. I would quote him at length, but I have a new poetic terror of Hildebrand Project panel chairs. So I offer this single sentence. Quote, we may venture to assert that expressions like calumny, malign aspersion, backbiting, slander, tale-bearing are now in their proper meanings scarcely intelligible to most people, to say nothing of their essential flavor and expressiveness having long since grown stale and flat. Pieper is making this point in light of St. Thomas's treatment of the human person's moral failings in speech in the Summa. A couple of observations on these questions from the Secunda Secundae. First, Thomas considers these failings, these sins, within his treatment of justice. In doing so, he identifies one's honor and good name as two aspects of our moral life that can be subject to a type of thievery or a harm. It seems to me that these are two additional notions that seem to have lost much of their social and moral significance. In my time with students and faculty, the ideas of honor and good name are non-existent. They do not have a role in our deepest moral conversations. Second, in the case of public speech, Thomas argues that those who entertain others who speak ill of their fellow man participate in a similar moral failing. If we are experiencing a collapse of our disagreement discourse, it may have every bit as much to do with its very large audience as its loudest voices. But let me return to Pieper. We are experiencing a deterioration of our conceptual inheritance that we have discovered needs to be maintained not simply by instinct, like the baaing of sheep or the clucking of hens, as professional as that might be, but through the cultivation of intellectual virtues, which indeed is like a type of stewardship. My 16-year-old nephew is an apprentice wooden boat builder in Maine. He's in his second year, and last summer he finished the first piece of his apprenticeship, and during that time he was able to meet one of the leading wooden boat designers in the world, elderly man in his early 80s, and they sat down at a bench on the bay. They spoke for 2 hours just about the craft of boat building and what it meant to his life. Peter, he finished up and he returned home, and a week later he found a package in the mail, and in it was this extraordinary, this beautiful block plane. Any of you who do woodworking, you'll know that a block plane is one of your go-to tools for roughing out. It's one of the most commonly used tools in any type of woodworking. And in it was a note, and it simply said that I had discovered that this block plane was no longer mine to care for anymore. It seemed clear to me that it is yours, and it's yours until it's not yours to care for anymore, and then it will be someone else's, right? It seems to me that folks laboring in the field of ideas and the gardens of young minds, we have much to learn from a similar posture towards our moral vocabulary. It's something that is maintained and cultivated, not something that's simply employed and used. My new friend and new teacher, if I say it, Dr. Crosby, noted the distinction in structure of religious, moral, and intellectual virtues. And while they stand in a certain hierarchy, it is also the case that basic failings in the cultivation, in the stewardship of intellectual virtues has a significant impact on our capacity for moral flourishing. It seems to me that our crisis in educational purpose involves the neglect of both types of virtues in our intellectual exchanges. And if this is the case, the cracks in our academic and public structures are large indeed and begin in the foundations. My second point regards some of the intentions and pressures young men and women have and face, such that the demonization of opposing views seems necessary. It seems necessary to identify certain people, certain views, possibly certain groups of people, as in fact evil. Modern democratic culture encourages us to feel obligated to overextend ourselves cognitively, especially in our philosophical, political, and civic opinions. Again, my colleague Peter observes that this is especially true among highly educated people, and by extension, I think, this is true of educating communities who seek to raise upright citizens and neighbors, as well as the next generation of teachers and professors. Many of the topics we argue about are truly important, and our arguments are accompanied by a pressing sense that the positions we hold should be held with an equal passion to the perceived importance of the topic at hand. In such situations, it feels irresponsible to say, I don't know. My colleague Peter and I often spend time with Yale students simply trying to tease out that phrase, simply trying to figure out if it's possible to get one of the elites to indicate that they truly just don't know. It isn't humanly possible to have a well-informed opinion on every topic in our age, and it is more responsible to be openly agnostic than to adopt a posture of informed conviction. I don't know. This is what's required. Or as my colleague Peter says, I'm not sure I have the information and opportunity of reflection to hold an informed judgment on that matter. I don't know is not a statement of civic indifference or philosophical dullness, if made honestly, but a statement of intellectual seriousness. I don't know, in some sense, is in some sense an intellectual pruning, the cutting back of possible unnecessary and unfruitful thoughts and opinions. In short, many of the students I know enter one of Vogelin's second-order realities simply because that is what it means to be a responsible citizen. It is easy to confuse the importance of a topic with the importance of your taking an argument about the topic. What is especially difficult about our important philosophical and political disagreements, especially in modern democracies in the digital age, is their relation to the public good. These topics are important to us and our colleagues largely because of their connection to certain principles of justice. And we all know that perceived injustices are an intelligible cause. Again, perceived injustices are an intelligible cause of the passion of anger. Anger, as Thomas tells us in the Treatise on the Passions, is a strange and unique passion. It's unstable. It's volatile. It is also, he notes in the Treatise on Justice, the primary cause of public and private false speech. This, it seems to me, is a dreadful combination, and it is a helpful diagnosis of some of the causes of demonization discourse, I think. Now some thoughts on a solution. The only human solution to anger that I know of is the shared life found in friendship. Shared loves, shared time, shared meals, shared sorrows, shared thoughts, the sharing ourselves as full persons, in which the good of the other becomes our own good. Acting for someone else's good becomes an intelligible reason for our own action. Some of my time with new natural lawyers may be coming out here. Upon the completion of our afternoon panel yesterday, Elizabeth looked at me with a shocked expression and whispered, "Patrick, we didn't say anything about friendship. How did we not say anything about friendship?" She was right, of course. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. So it's my turn now. What I intend to do is to begin with the reading selection from the reader, which is another text from Michael Novak, and actually carry it through. It's a truncated portion of the text, and I'd like to just speak through the rest of that section in his book. Now, before I get to the details, let me offer a quick word about the book from which the excerpt comes. It's this text titled "The Universal Hunger for Liberty." This was published in 2004, and its subtitle is "Why the Clash of Civilizations is Not Inevitable." So obviously playing off of the volume, Samuel Huntington's well-known volume. Novak's text was conceived and written immediately post 9/11. And he was anticipating the need for the West to engage more thoughtfully and thoroughly with Islamic culture and peoples. And in this book, Novak's argument is that a fruitful dialogue rooted in the concept of human liberty is possible. I don't necessarily personally endorse Novak's optimism whole cloth, but I do believe that what he offers in at least the section that I'm focusing on here, he offers some valuable exhortative and aspirational comments. In the assigned passage, he introduces what he calls the 4 cardinal virtues of human ecology. Now, human ecology we may take as synonymous with that term we introduced yesterday, moral ecology. In both cases, what we're talking about are the conditions that best promote and sustain human flourishing. Okay. So the four virtues that Novak highlights for us are in the order that he gives them to us. 1, cultural humility. 2, fidelity to truth. 3, respect for the dignity of the individual person. And 4, solidarity. I would quibble with that particular ordering. I would argue that fidelity to truth comes first, and then respect for the dignity of the human person, and then solidarity, and then cultural humility. But in any case, these 4 are virtues vital for the success of a free society and for what Novak is calling an adequate human ecology. Maybe not perfection, but an adequate situation. And these are needed specifically, especially in our world, which is increasingly globalized, interconnected, pluralistic. Okay, so our world is obviously a place where people now of different traditions, backgrounds, worldviews, value sets, etc., are encountering one another in greater and greater degrees. So let's just walk through these virtues one by one, beginning with cultural humility. Quick definition, this is simply a proper sense of one's own fallibility, past sins, limits, and characteristic faults, blind spots. Okay. These are universal. These faults derive from the natural human tendency to favor the self. It's not a bad thing. We're sort of programmed to look out for number 1. Self-love, self-preoccupation, which often results in what Novak also calls habitual inattention to others. These are universal things. We can't avoid them. And as universal things, they call for the universal need for corrective, cultural humility. Fine. Important caveat. Of course, cultural humility does not mean submitting to cultural relativism. The record is clear. Some cultures have done a better job than others, economically, in terms of establishing and maintaining the rule of law, upholding human rights, etc. So quite clearly, inarguably, it would be wrong to assert that all cultures are equally respectable or commendable in these terms. The basic idea here is simply that no one possesses the whole truth. And as such, necessarily we need the help of others to refine and broaden our own grasp of the truth. It's necessarily partial and limited and going to increase only through the help of others. And this, I can't help but when I hear Patrick stressing the importance of the statement, I don't know, it's very much the same idea here. Brings us nicely to the second virtue, of course, fidelity to truth. What this means, of course, is recognizing truth as a regulative ideal. The truth sits above all of us and regulates us. The truth alone is what makes conversation in light of evidence possible. To put the point negatively, without this respect for truth as a regulative ideal, what rules, what sits above us, is simply brute force, stark, naked power. And this is what we observe in corrupt political regimes. I'm the chair, so I'm going to take a liberty and read a quote. Those in the West who play with the idea that relativism is crucial for liberty are playing with fire. Since regimes built solely on the principle of lying, without any possibility of appeal to evidence and fair judgment, dwell under the sign of stark, naked power. Under that sign, thugs move into positions of leadership, and the finer spirits concerned about such niceties as evidence and argument are driven first to the periphery and eventually to prison. Against false imprisonment, one cannot shout injustice, for to that, thugs reply, says who? And one cannot say, those charges are false, for there is no longer any such thing as true or false. It is now power alone, that speaks. Okay. The third virtue, respect for the dignity of the individual person. This is quite a familiar idea, does not require much fleshing out or a defense in this context. It's worth noting, as Novak does, that this is a distinctly Judeo-Christian idea, not one found in the Greeks or elsewhere. Another quick passage. The human person is dignus, worthy of respect, sacred even, because he or she lives from the activities proper to God. To violate a human person is to denigrate the Almighty. It is an error to define individualism without reference to God and without reference to those other persons who share in God's life. A self-enclosed, self-centered individualism rests upon a misapprehension of the capacities of the human person, in whose light each person is judged by God, by other persons, and by conscience itself, whose light is God's activity in the soul. The person is a sign of God in history, or to speak more accurately, the person participates in God's own most proper activities, insight and choice. So human dignity needs God, derives from God, and points to God. So parenthetically, I might suggest a question. What does this mean for the possibility of secular human rights talk? Is that doomed? Is that possible? In any case, the fourth virtue, solidarity. Quick definition, this is the special virtue of social charity that makes each individual aware of belonging to the whole human race. This is related to, but certainly not the same thing as globalization. Novak writes, it is not an impersonal habit of losing oneself in groupthink or disappearing into a collectivity. It's not an abstraction. And here is really a personalist point that I think Novak is getting at. Solidarity, more importantly, or most importantly, signals something interior, something that happens in or inheres in the conscience of individuals, and with great practical upshot. It's an experience in the individual, in the person, that evokes responsibility, enlarges personal vision, and connects the responsible self to others. So this solidarity goes beyond merely respecting the other as like me. It goes beyond mere tolerance, you might say, and it means actually seeking to learn from and be enlarged by what is other. And on this point, I'm reminded of Professor Crosby's comments from this morning about intellectual empathy and the power of understanding the position of one's opponents. So to conclude, I would say that perhaps there are more or other virtues that are important for this area, but these four are not a bad start. All right, so thank you. Now we're grateful to hear from our colleagues from Thales Academy.
Thank you. I'm Molly Robidoux, and I just got introduced to personalism back in the spring. I got to meet Dr. Crosby and John Henry Crosby. Very interested in personalism. I'm a Catholic, but I'm also been an art teacher in an elementary school for the last 8+ years. So pulling a lot of this together has been very interesting for me. Disagreement without demonization. I do want to say that as a respondent, which I've never done this before, especially with a room full of academia, I plan to embrace Dr. Plato's virtue of amateurness. That's going to be me up here. But I took July 1st as a day to I went to Mass, and I analyzed the world news that day. And I thought that would be a real simplistic way to bring up disagreement without demonization and see what would work and what might not work. Anyway, I'm going to go into the gospel story real briefly. It was a Luke gospel story at Mass on July 1st, and it was Jesus was walking along a path with the disciples, and he was wanting to stop there, and the people were not wanting to receive him. They were tired, they were hungry, the people were not wanting to receive them. So the disciples said to Jesus, should we bring down the heavens and bring fire down upon them? And, and he basically rebuked them and said, no, let's press on to the next village. And I would have to argue that that is disagreeing without demonization. Perhaps Jesus hoped that when they got to the next village, some of those villagers would have heard what great things he did in that following village and wished that they could have let them into their home, kind of thing. So I think that worked. That was successful for Jesus. Bringing it back to real world news, on that very same day, July 1st, I turned on the news, and there I saw in Portland, Oregon, there was an Antifa group or an anti-fascist group that was demonstrating or protesting against another group, a right-wing group called the Proud Boys. When this occurred, the protesters clashed, and they hurled a cement-packed milkshake at a reporter. There apparently was no assistance from any police presence, and there was a short, uninformed mention from the city mayor about the violence that occurred on a citizen that was within his rights to be at this demonstration. Upon reflection, I believe this shows disagreement with demonization. How does Antifa promote their cause to the Proud Boys in this manner? My assertion is that they're not achieving their ultimate goal of getting the Proud Boys any closer to understanding their plight and why they were protesting. Conversely, on that same day in the world news, there was a historic moment as the U.S. president stepped over the line at the demilitarized zone with the North Korean dictator. All of the news reports were saying that 3 previous presidents had not been able to get that far. And they had tried maybe potentially traditional channels and methods, and none had worked to create peace in that region. Now, I say, as I think about this, were these past administrations possibly both disagreeing and demonizing the behavior of the North Korea in their chosen traditional methods? So while it's true that there are most certainly horrors and injustices occurring in North Korea, I see this attempt by the U.S. president as a means to open the channel of communication first, and we've talked about this, with human contact, with eyesight, with a handshake. It's very, very important to the soul. And we should not underestimate that. But furthermore, the U.S. president did disagree continuously with the North Korean tactics all along. However, this time, he chose not to demonize them, as he had previously with his Rocket Man comments. All of you might remember that. So that, to me, was a demonization in front of the world, and yet this time he chose not to. He got over the line. They shook hands. We will furthermore see what might take place. Perhaps this is a successful means of disagreeing without demonization that can bring peace to that region. So those are my thoughts.
I'm Wanda Evans, first grade teacher at Thales Academy, and we kind of took everything from the worldview and brought it down into the classroom. Of course, in first grade, we have all kinds of arguments all the time about everything. And those are my scissors. No, I wanted the blue ones. You know, we disagree. It's our life. But there are ways to disagree respectfully with one another. Disagreements are inevitable because we are all different. We have different cultures in the classrooms, people from different countries, different religions, different socioeconomic statuses, males, females. There's tons of differences. But you can disagree without having the other person feel demonized. Now, of course, it's on a smaller scale in the classroom, and sometimes it's harder to actually spot when you actually do disagree and demonize a child. It's harder because you're usually caught up in the moment. You don't realize that it has affected them until maybe later on you're reflecting on it that night and you're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. We've all had those instances, even just dealing with colleagues or other people, it happens. And so now it's, well, how do I see that? I can definitely see it on a worldview, and it's easy because I'm outside of the situation. Well, what happens when I'm actually inside of the situation and it's something that I'm so, I don't even think about, or it's something that I'm so passionate about if you're having a discussion in high school, ethics, for example. So when a disagreement occurs in your classroom, it's up to you to kind of be the mediator, to step in and to model and show the kids, okay, this is how we disagree without disrespecting one another, and have an open dialogue back and forth. It's great with our Socratic seminars that we have. They really help the kids question each other. The best way to do it, having the Socratic dialogue, is the kids are questioning themselves. So a lot of times, you question them, they respond to your question, and you get them to kind of think through what it is, so that these conversations happen naturally in their head on their own, so that way nobody feels victimized. Nobody feels like somebody just, that person just doesn't like me. My teacher just doesn't like me. She just doesn't get it. And we never want anybody, even if they're not your favorite, you never want anybody to feel like they're not your favorite. So the best way to disagree is, I found, through a Socratic dialogue. In the classroom, it's a lot easier, especially in first grade. However, the big issue that I've had in the past, or, I think in general educators have, is more with parents not agreeing on something. You gave my child an F. No, ma'am, I did not give your child an F. They earned it. I mean, great. Like, it's better than a 0. Find the positive in it. But in a parent-teacher conference, they have gone so poorly and so terrifically. We're not going to agree all the time, and that's okay. There are some things that, as a teacher in the classroom and outside of the classroom, you are not going to budge on. Some things are out of your control. You can't budge on them because it's school policy. But there are things you just can't give up. You can't budge on. You've got to stay, firm in. But there are other things you can. And we're not always going to agree all the time. But the most important thing is that when a parent leaves a parent-teacher conference, they might not like the decision that I've made because I've stuck to my guns. But at the end of the day, they just want to feel heard. They want to feel like you have heard their concerns and, okay, I hear you, I got you. Now let's move forward and see where we can go from here, because you have got to keep that working relationship with parents, or it's the child that suffers every time. So, just having them feel respected, heard, definitely not demonizing, thinking things through first, maybe coming back with a response later, and giving in with certain things that you're able to kind of be more flexible with. But those small things are really big for a parent, and it makes them feel like, oh, okay, this teacher has my child's best interest at heart. So it's not, we're not always going to agree, but we can disagree respectfully.